Hi there, John Wilkinson, History Made Easier. A video on Stalin's economic policies. It's not going to cover everything, how could it? But it will provide, I think, a useful context to those policies, essentially the economic legacy that Lenin left him with, and it will present alternative reasons for both his agricultural policies and his industrial policies. I think you'll find it interesting. So, Stalin's economic policies, and my overarching question, how far was Stalin in control? But a more targeted question, did Stalin use the agricultural crisis of 1926-7 to force through a socialist economy? Or was he forced by events into a drastic but pragmatic reaction? In other words, back to my overarching question, was he in control of events or not? And being the beginning of Stalin's consolidation of power, the context is Lenin's economic policies. Lenin had wanted to transform the economy from capitalism to socialism, but at the outset had been really forced into pragmatic policies, the legal transfer of land ownership and the nationalisation of much of industry was taking place in theory, but in practice not so much, particularly land. The peasants were seizing land and really that seizure was being legitimised by the Bolsheviks, and ownership was still in private hands, transferring from the landed elites to the peasants. But as a consequence of the Civil War and war communism, grain supplies were being forcefully requisitioned, and industries were more and more being placed under state control. But once the Civil War was over, the unpopularity of war communism forced Lenin to take another pragmatic step, a step backwards as far as the socialist economy was concerned, and he introduced what came to be known as the New Economic Policy, NEP. And this restored a significant degree of private ownership. The peasantry under license were allowed to grow grain for the private market, and we have the development of the wealthier peasants, the kulaks, and most smaller industrial enterprises were denationalised, in other words, privatised, with only the big industries remaining nationalised. And Lenin's death led to the fight for party leadership and the debate between permanent revolution and socialism in one country. And socialism in one country would require or enable at least a more socialist drive as far as the economy was concerned. Well, a more socialist drive all around. So we come to the agricultural crisis of 1926-7 and the need for a radical change of policy. Agriculture and industry in most economies are closely linked to each other. There are some economies that are heavily lean towards either agriculture or industry, but but in most successful economies there is a balance between the two, and they are closely linked. And in the USSR this was certainly the case, but they were also linked to Lenin's legacy and the debate surrounding socialism in one country. The essence was that agriculture needed to be more efficient if you were going to industrialize, because you're going to have a bigger urban population, a bigger industrial workforce, and so the same amount of food would be needed, and so agriculture would need to be more efficient. And Russian agriculture was very backward, very small-scale peasant holdings, and that would not sustain industrialization. Agriculture was also needed because agricultural exports would pay for the mass industrialization that a modern economy needed, and Russia at this point desperately needed. It wasn't a modern economy. But the peasantry, if they're going to be working hard, producing food more efficiently, would want farm tools and machinery. And they would want some reward in the shape of consumer goods. And industry simply didn't meet those needs, as the Bolsheviks had to prioritize heavy industry, the likes of coal, the likes of iron and steel, because it's heavy industry that is going to enable the whole industrializing process. You need those basics. Coal will produce electricity. Iron and steel will produce the framework of the rest of the industrial process, from machinery to rail track to shipping and trains for transport. So heavy industry had to be prioritized. So there was no incentive for peasants to work hard and produce surpluses, because there was a lack of consumer goods. So my first prognosis is that Stalin was reacting to what was happening. The NEP was failing, and Stalin had to react, had to do something. He simply had no choice. The NEP was not satisfying consumer goods, and faced with political humiliation, Stalin was faced with making further concessions or taking a tougher line. Further concessions would be moving further away from a socialist economy, and that was the big issue. But it was also an opportunity for Stalin. It gave him an opportunity to eliminate his remaining opponents. The main target at this point being Bukharin. This argument would say Stalin reacted by operating the lever he understood most: brutal force. It would also suggest that it was a panic measure, and Stalin didn't really know where he was taking the Soviet Union, what path he was taking it down. So it was a reaction a blind reaction almost. Stalin reacted to the needs of the working class and the dangers posed by the peasantry. Both the urban proletariat, the urban working class, and the conservative peasantry, both were growing in importance. And an authoritarian leader, a one-party state, a state dedicated to a defined revolution, had to stay in control. The urban proletariat, above all, wanted readily available food and job security, both of which required an agricultural economy subservient to those needs. It had to supply the food, and it needed to also supply exports in order to continue the development of industrialization. But the peasantry wanted those higher food prices, and they wanted consumer goods. But a consumer-driven economy would not guarantee that job security for the urban workers, so something had to give. So at one and the same time, Stalin was reacting to the needs of the urban proletariat in the cities, food, job security, but also to the dangers posed by a capitalist, although primitive capitalist, orientated peasantry. A peasantry that wanted to make money and buy things with it. Change then was forced on Stalin. At first, Stalin had favoured the NEP. Partly it was the need to be seen to be a true disciple of Lenin. But that agricultural crisis in 26 and 27, caused by the peasants' frustration at the lack of consumer goods, a crisis in which less than 20% of the grain produced was reaching the cities, brought the crisis in the cities, and in its wake, that need for radical change. And radical change Stalin forced through. Compulsory collectivization of land and the first 5-year plan under the control of Gosplan in 1928, with its emphasis on heavy industry, coal and steel, as I've already mentioned, and oil, electricity, and increasingly armaments. But there's an alternative argument here, and that is that Stalin was always ideologically driven. Stalin was asserting ideological control. We're going to get back to doing things the socialist way. Stalin had accepted that socialism in one country had to focus on enlarging the urban proletariat. He had to curb consumerism and develop state-controlled heavy industry if the revolution was going to survive. Capitalism had to be eradicated, and since it was most prominent in the peasantry, Stalin felt able to justify using the peasants, attacking the peasants to subsidize industrial development and reducing consumerism in the process. The state's needs were more important than those of the peasantry. Agriculture and collectivization, again with the focus on asserting ideological control, doing it the socialist way. Stalin was able to force change on that conservative peasantry and a conservative party, actually, that was frightened by the pace of change. And he did this by ruthlessly exercising his power. The NEP was producing a capitalist system. There's no argument about that. It was, as we would call in the West at the time, a mixed economy, part socialist, part capitalist. The kulaks were becoming a rural petty bourgeoisie. They were a rural middle class. And so it was the change that Stalin forced through was a deliberate and calculated policy. It was an admission of the failure to generate social change voluntarily. The peasantry weren't volunteering for anything of the sort. They had got their land. They now wanted to make small profits and reap the benefits of their hard work. The same with industrialization. There's the argument that Stalin was asserting ideological control, doing things the socialist way. It now would be a planned economy. It would be a command economy, commanded by the state. You make this quantity of tractors because that's what the state needs. You make this quantity of fertilizer because that's what the state needs. You dig out of the ground this amount of coal because that's what the state needs, what the state commands. And so it's meeting state needs, not a consumer-driven economy. Doing it the socialist way. But there's another argument as well, and this is where I close this look at Stalin's economic policies. That Stalin was also planning for the likelihood of war. He knew that the Western world, the capitalist countries, were never going to accept a communist country. And so war of some nature was going to be inevitable in Stalin's eyes. And so he had to prepare the Soviet Union for this. Hence the command economy geared to the survival of the Soviet regime against the hostility of the Western powers. Again, the link to socialism in one country. In 1931, Stalin, in a speech, said, "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries, behind them economically, behind them in the industrialization process. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed." So again, ideologically driven, because the bottom line was saving the revolution, but with a stronger eye on the need to invest in heavy industry, not so much because it's the basis of any consumer economy, but because it would be needed to prepare the Soviet Union for war. And the second and third 5-year plans and their increasing focus on heavy industry and their increasing focus on armaments can be seen in this light. The Soviet Union was being put on a war footing. The 5-year plans were gearing the Soviet Union to total war. Hopefully, it would be at a time of Stalin's choosing. It didn't work out that way, but Stalin was hoping it would. But Stalin, I still think, was seeking to develop a socialist economy by developing a bigger urban proletariat, which of course was lacking in the telescoped revolution that Lenin had forced on the Bolsheviks and forced on Russia. And so state-controlled industrial enterprises, as well as the collectivization of agriculture, simply had to be pushed through. So there you have 3 alternative perspectives, 3 alternative interpretations of just why Stalin really forced through a radical change to the Soviet Union's economy. Was he reacting because the legacy left by Lenin was crumbling? Was he ideologically driven? Or was he really driven by the need to save the revolution because he was expecting war? In truth, it will be a bit of all 3. Where you put the balance depends on your interpretation, your evaluation of these 3 arguments. So there you go. Stalin's economic policies. So as always, I hope you found that interesting and useful. And as always, I thank you for listening. Cheers.